This is a Founding Media podcast, produced at Austin Community College District. Welcome to Science in the Mall, y'all. I'm your host, Dan Dillard. After the mad rush to develop the COVID vaccination in 2020, the biggest COVID-19 update of 2021 has been the emergency approval and rollout of the vaccines. Despite this positive breaking news, it's clouded in misinformation and lack of understanding of how vaccines work. That is why this episode is all about diving deeper into the COVID vaccine and how vaccines are developed, tested, and brought to market. We're joined by two very qualified guests to help us learn more. Janet Walkow has a PhD in pharmaceutics and pharmacokinetics. After owning her own pharmaceuticals company, she is now the Executive Director and Chief Technology Officer of the Drug Dynamics Institute at the College of Pharmacy at the University of Texas. Our other guest, Timothy Sullivan, is the founder and president of Zeteo Biomedical LLC and president and CEO of Mystic Pharmaceuticals. Over the past 40 years, he's created breakthrough technologies and products in the pharmaceutical industry. Let's jump into our conversation to get answers to all your vaccine questions. Welcome to our podcast. Thanks for being with us. How are you guys doing today?
Doing great. Thank you.
Lovely day in Texas.
Janet and Tim, it's wonderful to chat with you. I've been looking forward to our conversation, our joint conversation together, all around vaccines. Janet, before we start off and get into the nitty-gritty about vaccines, will you tell the audience just a 2-minute version of your history and your involvement with vaccines, and we'll then go to Tim after that.
Thank you very much, Dan. My first involvement was in my first job, which was in the pharmaceutical industry, where I headed up all the liquid, semi-solid, and sterile product development. And so I had experience with all sorts of injected materials and worked on several projects. And after leaving the pharmaceutical industry, where I had my own company, I got a little bit out of the actual science, but then I joined the University of Texas in 2008, where I run the Drug Dynamics Institute, where I'm very embedded in preclinical drug development activities, also for some devices, and heading up a lot of technology readiness types of programs at the university.
Really, really cool. Tim, what about you?
Well, my involvement in the vaccine space began about 12 or 13 years ago when we were developing packaging and delivery devices for vaccines. And our focus was really around the next generational push into how to deliver vaccines across very broad populations. And so we were focused on delivery devices that essentially enabled self-administration into the nose. And we developed an entire platform for packaging and delivering vaccines in liquid form, powder form, or reconstituted powder form, and being able to scale up the what's called fill, fit, finish side of the equation. It's one of the big challenges going on now, which is to be able to produce very large volumes of vaccines and put them into devices that could then be deployed across large populations and actually self-administered.
Thank you. That was really cool, and I want to dive into what you just said here. One of the things that we're seeing now is just these questions about vaccines. Is just what are the logistical problems to get these things out? But before we dive into that, what is y'all's thought on how fast these vaccines have been developed? I feel like it's for most of us in waiting, well, it's taken a long time, but it's been record timing. So, what are your thoughts on the timing?
Well, having been in the pharmaceutical industry for a number of years, I'm very familiar with the typical lengthy time it takes to develop a product. The average is about 10 to 14 years, moving from actual discovery to commercialization. And to have something like this developed in under a year, to finish the early parts of a phase 3 trial with the kind of data that they have, is just remarkable. Like I said, it can take up to 14 years. It typically takes somewhere between $2 and $3 billion to do this, and a lot of person power. And for this to happen in this amount of time is truly a turning point, I think, in developing new ways to approach vaccines.
Yeah, Tim, you and I were talking about some of the challenges just historically bringing out a new vaccine versus, we're talking about the various ways that they could be administered to the body. You want to touch on what we've seen historically when it comes to vaccines?
Sure. The typical approach to administering a vaccine is typically through either an intramuscular or subcutaneous injection, and that's been the way it's been done for almost 100 years. I mean, since we've really been developing them, and it's deeply embedded in the development process. So a lot of that legacy sort of carries on. Over the last couple of decades, though, we've started to see something of a shift to sort of look at new ways of administering vaccines that aren't dependent on an injectable approach. And the challenge with an injectable approach is that there's a lot of infrastructure required in order to be able to make that happen. Typically, people can't self-administer an injection, and so you have to have some sort of healthcare infrastructure in place to facilitate that. The other aspect of this really revolves around the development of new forms of vaccines that can not only be administered non-invasively, but and can potentially be self-administered, but also don't necessarily require some of the cold chain infrastructure that we see today. So there's a lot of evolution that's occurring very rapidly, not only in the development of the vaccines themselves, but also in the form that they take, the packaging of them, and the administration of them.
Janet, one thing I thought was really fascinating in our earlier conversation was that even though it has fast-tracked, the vaccine has fast-tracked faster than we've seen before, there are many people that are going to wait it out, kind of see more results coming forward. What should people be asking themselves about the vaccine, even though it has been approved? I think we talked about, it's an emergency approval, so it was fast-tracked. You want to talk about that a little bit more?
Sure. A lot of people are under the impression that the vaccines are formally approved, and what they were approved for was for emergency use. This is very limited phase 3 data. Typically, you could see up to like 50 to 100,000 people in a phase 3 trial, and you saw much fewer in terms of the numbers. So, for example, in the Pfizer trial, I don't have the exact numbers with me, but when you hear about 95% efficacy is different than being effective, because what they did was to take a certain population. It was somewhere around 170 people, if I'm not mistaken, and they tracked back how many of those people were infected with COVID-19 and at least were symptomatic. So there's another variable. They couldn't really track the asymptomatic folks who may have had it. And then they did the calculation that in 95% of the people who had the vaccine, that they were protected.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a small population. And even when you develop a drug using tens of thousands of people in a phase 3 trial, that's still considered a very small population, because until something gets out into the public sector where you literally have tens of millions of people using a medication, you don't know which of the side effects may be prevalent. So what we were able to get with this is efficacy, which is a hugely important number, since we don't have the time to wait to really have the sophisticated types of trials that typically are put in place. But what we will be able to tell over time how effective this is. And people should not be alarmed if it's less than 95%, because there's a lot of factors that aren't in there. Mm-hmm. I also like to remind people when they say, well, some of these are only 80%, effective. And I go, the flu vaccine is somewhere between 40 to 60%.
Oh, wow. I did not know that.
So I think you just have to put everything in relation to other information that we have. And I'm actually very heartened that I heard a news report this week that more and more people are open to getting the vaccine. I think that it was, I forget the numbers, but it's something like 26 million people have received at least one dose, and I believe it's around 6 million people have had 2 doses.
Okay.
And while it needs to be much higher, I know that the Austin Public Health website is being reconstructed because I think somewhere like 500,000 people were trying to sign up to get their vaccine through them.
Backlog for sure. Tim, one thing I thought was really fascinating in our earlier conversation was talking about the different ways to administer medicine into the body. So you were talking earlier, injection is one of them, but the test itself is done via the nose, right? And so a different kind of administration is much more efficient in what your experience has been.
So typically, an intramuscular injection takes some number of weeks in order to achieve full systemic immunity. So the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, it's a 2-dose regimen, right? And the estimates are that you achieve full systemic immunity a couple of weeks after the second dose. You're building immunity, so you're getting some level of benefit from it as you're waiting for that to happen. There have been the route of infection, the typical route of infection, for COVID-19 and for influenza and for a number of these other sort of pathogens, is the respiratory tract. You breathe it in, you may get it on your, get it on your fingers and rub your eyes, but the respiratory tract is the typical route of infection. And so if you can actually if you can administer a vaccine, say intranasally as an example, and initiate an immune response in the tract, in the respiratory tract, you can potentially reduce the risk of infection. And there's a fair amount of clinical data that exists with some other vaccines, not with the current COVID mRNA vaccines, but with some of the vaccines that were developed for influenza that were nasally administered, which showed that an immune response was initiated within about 2 days of administration intranasally, and full systemic immunity was achieved actually within 3 or 4 days. So much faster onset of the immune response and a very quick immune response, partial immune response, in the respiratory tract. And so that actually presents that's another one of those factors that as we look at there's actually now a handful of vaccines that are in development for COVID that are being developed for intranasal administration. And so as part of that process, as those make it through the clinical process and we get more data on those, we'll be able to determine if those kinds of vaccines can also provide that same level of benefit.
That would be awesome. What piqued my interest the most in this is if we can compress the time that our bodies adapt to the vaccination, obviously then that puts a much bigger dent in the spread of COVID. So
exactly.
Janet, what are your thoughts on intranasal versus injection, or have you had that experience?
Oh, I'm a big believer in the better way you can deliver it, store it, ship it, and access it is the way to go. And a lot of the folks at the College of Pharmacy are working in this area. This is their specialization. They've worked on a lot of inhaled products. And there's so many advantages, whether you're using a powder. You can also use different technologies to administer these powders that you just reduce so many barriers to access. And I think that's probably what we're seeing now are these barriers to people being able to access the vaccine because of how it needs to be stored, how it needs to be administered, and how it needs to get to these distribution points. So I'm a big fan of that. And there's a lot of research going on at UT in this area.
That's one thing that I wanted hopefully get both of you guys to comment on is what we hear things on the news as far as here's what's happening, the problems, and here's where some of the failures are. What are your opinions on the rollout, how fast it's happening, and some of maybe the bottlenecks, and how can those be improved?
It would never be fast enough. I think that we're doing the best we can, given that there was very little direction. I think what should have happened was to create an infrastructure and a distribution plan so that every state didn't have to figure it out on their own and then iterate and iterate again to figure out how best to do this. Because in the beginning, there were a lot of unused doses because they weren't in the right places that knew how to do anything with them, with the kind of speed that you need to deal with, getting these vaccines into people's arms. So in terms of, that's one of the biggest part, the distribution and the planning. When you see websites going down, when a website opens and 3 hours later, no one can get an appointment, when no one's really tracking who's getting the vaccine and then shifting who is eligible for the vaccine. We want our kids in school, but teachers aren't a priority. There are very few people who I've talked to who have been asked to show ID, and people are being able to sign up using all sorts of methods, whether they are in the 1A or 1B category. They may not be. And so it's kind of like the Wild West right now in terms of how it's being done. I do think that with the new administration, that there's going to be more help in making this work and getting it out in a better way. But with all the problems, especially, I don't know if most people understand what's involved with the -80 freezer. I'm having a new -80 freezer brought into the labs, and you have to have a new plug installed, which is not a simple process. It doesn't plug into a regular wall plug.
Wow.
And so it's taking us weeks to get this work order. And this isn't for the vaccine, but a lot of our stability studies we do at -80 degrees. And it's hard. And actually right now in science, it's a big problem. You can't buy a refrigerator or freezer with any speed. It's a real problem for researchers right now. So moving towards something, as Tim was describing, where you don't have that cold chain storage requirement would just be huge, because not only is it expensive and it takes up a lot of space, but it's not viable for a mass distribution like we're facing right now.
Yeah, Tim, what are your opinions on that?
Well, if you look at the countries that have done what I would consider to be a better job of this, the characteristic there is that they had a top-down approach to this. This is a massively complex undertaking from a strategic perspective, and we didn't follow that. That approach in this. And so states and municipalities were left to try and solve the problem at the local level, and then at the, regional level, and then at the state level. And a lot of those things just weren't connected because it wasn't driven from the top down. So my own observation, like I had to schedule a vaccine appointment for my 91-year-old mother. She lives in Arizona, right? And she would have never been able to navigate the complexity of that process on her own. And she's actually reasonably computer literate, but the websites didn't work properly. When we managed, in fact, we ended up scheduling an appointment. They didn't have it in their system. She showed up anyway, and they gave it to her. And then they had her fill out a piece of paper, to try and log her in. We got it, but it was there was a lot of stress in the process. So I think as we go forward, the efforts that are being unfolded now, will get that aligned. And this is a long-term sort of process, right? We're learning some lessons on this go around, but we're going to face situations like this, as a civilization going forward. This is not the last pandemic that Earth is going to face, right? And so we need to learn from this and put in place those mechanisms. And there were actually some of this planning work was done a decade ago following the H1N1 pandemic. Now, that wasn't anywhere near as deadly as this one was, but there was a lot of infrastructure that was created. Unfortunately, between the time that was created and the next decade that unfolded after that was put in place, a lot of that was not maintained. A lot of that thinking, a lot of that planning work was really not maintained. And from a human perspective, that's a challenging thing to do, right? We tend to think short term, and long term in these kinds of situations. And it's easy to make decisions about cutting funding for those kinds of putting that kind of infrastructure in place and maintaining it just in case. It's a very challenging thing to try and undertake to do, but it's necessary.
And I just wanted to add to that. It's my observation that in countries where there is single payer nationalized health systems, it's been rolled out totally differently.
Seamlessly.
People are not scrambling to make an appointment. It's something that's been very easy to do. Sometimes they're the ones being contacted, but there's another benefit. I know that Pfizer is working with Israel because they have a single payer system, and they're trading information. Pfizer now is going to get access to their information because that's how you really track how the process is going, what your effective rate is, with the vaccine, and you're looking at a total population, not just pockets of a population. So some of these countries who have single payer systems are, I think, going to go way ahead of us in many ways. They might have been slower to the rollout, but it's going to be much more effective because I really worry about access. And I have said that once I've had my second vaccine in 2 weeks, then that's one of the things that I want to personally work on, because there are a lot of people that even if they have a phone or a computer, they could never navigate what we're having to navigate, at least here in Texas, to get an appointment.
I think also that, as we go forward and as some of these new technologies, for instance, we're working on a room temperature, nasally administered next generation vaccine with our partner, Iowa State University, the Nano Vaccine Institute at Iowa State University, and they're developing the vaccine. Zateo has developed actually the delivery system for that. We're in preclinical testing right now, but our target is to continue to advance this with the idea that it could serve as a next generation vaccine platform, not just for COVID, but it's a protein subunit vaccine, and it's a platform. And so we're actually working on both pandemic influenza and COVID in parallel. And that entire platform is set up so that we can actually very rapidly develop new vaccines, drop it into the protein subunit platform, drop it into our nasal delivery system, and run it through the same production facility. So response time potentially goes way down. And because you have you don't have ideally the cold chain requirements to manage it. It's a self-administered device. You don't have to deal with Sharps disposals of spent needles after the fact. The entire system becomes dramatically simplified and a lot easier to roll out as new threats sort of emerge and we have to respond to them.
That's amazing. I just looking at the future. Has anything like that been done before? Self-administering vaccines?
No, it's been somewhat controversial in the past. It's been discussed. I was involved in discussions a decade ago as we were exploring different. There was scenario planning work that went on that was driven by FEMC. Right, which is part of HHS, and we looked at scenarios. We did some scenario planning around that sort of a concept. It's been tested in very small programs to sort of test out the feasibility for it, but it has not previously been rolled out broadly as a self-administered approach. Probably the nasal flu vaccine that people are familiar with would be a product called FluMist, which is an AstraZeneca product. That's for seasonal influenza, but that's in a nasal delivery device, which actually has to be cold chained, and you don't self-administer it. You have to go to a healthcare provider to get it. They administer it. And that device is not really designed for self-administration either.
I was going to ask, what's the big hang up on having people administer themselves? Is it the needle? is it if people aren't using the needle, maybe it's maybe it's easier to self-administer? What's y'all's opinion?
Yeah. There's high incidence of needle phobia. I mean, just that's a big aspect of it. There's also some targeted places where the administration needs to take place, so you can't just jab that needle anywhere. You also have to once you have administered it, you now have a biohazard, right? So you have to properly dispose of those needles, right? And you think of it in the context of, well, it's just one, but we're talking about in this country we're going to end up with 700 million of them, right? That have to be processed. And abuse of used syringes is a huge problem in other countries. Particularly in certain developing nations, there's been large efforts, to try and develop syringes that are essentially disable themselves after use, so they don't get repurposed, for other uses and potentially spread disease that way, right? So moving away from the needle generally, I think is going to be a sort of a positive, forward movement for this, particularly if we can get to a point where it's something as simple as stick this in your nose and push the button and then throw it away and you're done.
Sounds way more efficient. Sounds like the future.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got a question for you both, and this is just going to be like the typical audience questions. I'm talking with family members, and the question comes up all the time is, what's the difference between the cold vaccine, and is that because of preservatives that they're needing it cold, or is it, and the room temperature vaccine? Could you guys get into the details on what the differences are?
Go ahead, Tim.
Sure. So in the COVID world, there are 4 different types of vaccines, right? 4 different basic approaches to developing the vaccine. There's the traditional whole virus, which has been used for a long time, and those are typically they're either live attenuated vaccines. They take the bug and they sort of attenuate it, meaning that they sort of disable aspects of it so that it isn't as virulent, and then they inject it and your body sort of responds to it. And that has been used for many, many decades. That was the original approach. Protein subunits, the mRNA, protein subunit is another approach. The mRNA and viral vectors are the other sort of 3 approaches. The Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines are nucleic acid, basically mRNA vaccines. The advantage to that is that they're relatively easy to produce, and you can sort of make them in, cost effectively in volume, but they're very fragile. They have to be, the actual messenger RNA has to be wrapped in a shell to protect it because it's extremely fragile. And so not only do you have to put it in a shell, but then you basically have to reduce all of the molecular action that's going down on there by freezing it down at minus 80 C. Mm-hmm. And once you thaw it, you can't refreeze it.
Okay.
Right? It's like chicken. You can put it in the freezer once, but when you thaw it out, you got to cook it and eat it. And that's the mRNA vaccines are the same way. So there's efforts now. The protein subunit vaccines that are in development now, and they're, by last count, by our estimates, we try and track all of the different vaccine programs, development programs for COVID running around the world. The last time we looked at it, which was about a week and a half ago, there were something like 128 different development programs unfolding. Wow. Quite a few. And a percentage of those are protein subunit. And in particular, in the protein subunit space, they're looking at formulating them. They actually start out as a powder, right? And as a powder form. And in that particular space, you have a biodegradable carrier material, right, which carries the vaccine, and they load the vaccine into that, right? And then the original development work that we were involved in, they would take that and then they would dilute it. They would basically rehydrate it in a liquid form, put it into a syringe, and develop it. And so our work in that evolved that to basically look at, well, can we package it and dispense it as a powder? Well, a powder has a lot less sort of molecular activity in it than a liquid does, right? And right now, that in that particular project and in other projects going on like that, and there are a number of them where powder is the basis for the vaccine. It's packaged as a powder and it's delivered as a powder. We're much closer to basically, having room temperature based formulations.
Oh, wow.
So whether or not the mRNA vaccines can get there is a question, and whether or not they could be used could be actually repurposed for nasal delivery is another question. We actually also have technology which allows us to do reconstitution on the fly in a nasal device. And we're doing some preliminary development work around that concept as well, where the vaccine may be best administered as a liquid, but to package it and to ship it and to store it, it's better off doing it in a powder form. And we actually developed 8 or 9 years ago a device that you can package the powder and a liquid in separate chambers inside the device, and then you just flip a switch on the device, you actually unlock it, and it mixes it together and then dispenses it as a liquid. So that's another sort of new area that's unfolding as a potential way to sort of deal with this. How do you reduce the complexity of packaging, storing, deploying, and using? I don't think it's been publicly disclosed the difference, what causes the difference between the Moderna vaccine in terms of cold chain requirements. I suspect it has to do probably with the fact that Janet, your colleague, was working on it with Moderna early on, right? I mean, both of those were derived off of it, but it's probably the fact that it's that influence and that research and that that effort behind it which made the difference. They had more time to figure out how to reduce the the storage temperature to minus 20°C is essentially froze. It's a standard freezer.
My understanding before the conversation with you, Tim, was that it was more of a preservative, but you said no, it's not a preservative. It's essentially a very, very delicate the type of vaccine, and the way to keep it stable is to keep it at that temperature. Is that correct? Right. And I haven't read anything to say the opposite, but there's never read that one is better than the other. They're just different approaches to tackle the problem. Is that right? They're
actually very similar. Mm-hmm. I mean, and they're quite similar. And with time, I mean, right now Pfizer is actually working on a next generation version of that, which will reduce the cold chain requirements. Yet to be seen, sort of what it is. And in fact, I recently read something that they're working on a powder version. So everybody's now focused on dealing with the other side of the equation, the logistic side of the equation, right? That there just wasn't much focus on. And that's actually, historically, that's always been the case. I mean, from our experience is, in the pharma industry, the focus has largely been on develop the therapeutic and prove it, it's safe and efficacious, it works, and we'll worry about the rest of it later, right? But the problem is that when you have a rapidly moving problem like this, you gotta think end to end, because it doesn't matter if you got a great vaccine if you can't get it into people, efficiently. You don't have a solution.
I just want to pick up on something, Tim, that you started talking about in terms of the economic impact. I think one of the differences with what we're seeing with COVID-19 and what's going on, with the vaccines is that I don't know one person who hasn't had some sort of impact. It could be economic, it could be physical, it could be mental. Everybody's been impacted, and everybody who I know is just like questing for more information about all sorts of things. Mm-hmm. And we had the public's attention now, and I think it's a great opportunity, not just for scientists, but for folks in public policy and communicating things effectively, because I'm guessing that Tim also gets calls every day from friends and relatives asking questions because they want to know more. And these are really intelligent people, and it's shocking how little they know.
One of the biggest questions I get all the time or conversations I get into all the time is it safe? Because people mistakenly, have noticed that it takes 15 years to build something, and this has been in less than a year. And so automatically there's this association that we rushed through all of this and we didn't do the work that we needed to do to get it passed. And so there's a fear there of whether to take it or not. So I guess the way I look at it is, what's more dangerous, a side effect from vaccination or coronavirus itself? So how would you guys
becomes a risk
that?
management exercise, right? I mean, you're managing risk. And when you're losing, 4,000 people a day, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a legitimate concern. I mean, we did cut corners, and it's not like they've stopped testing it. They've continued to test it, they're collecting data in real time. I mean, I got mine and, I got my first vaccine a couple of weeks ago. And, I get every day I get a survey text to me from, asking me, for symptoms and that sort of stuff. Right. And I assume that they're doing that more broadly. The bottom line is it's a risk mitigation strategy, a risk management calculation, right? And hopefully, we're not going to see any long-term sort of issues a year from now or 2 years from now or 5 years from now. But it's going to take some time to sort of determine that, I think.
Yeah, there's always a risk with every new product. I mean, that's why you see recalls sometimes 2, 3, 4 years down the road. But I'm very heartened by the data that people who have received the vaccine are not being hospitalized. Right. If they were to get COVID, they're not being hospitalized, which means it's working.
Right.
And it's having a huge impact.
Right.
And
it's turning the ship, that's for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So long term, I don't know. I mean, no one knows. Right. But right now, the short term is really important.
It amazes me how much when everybody focuses on something, there's a lot of solutions to it. Sometimes we do things the old-fashioned way because that's just the way it's been done. But there's many other ways to do it. Janet, I'm curious, you working with UT and all, are you seeing a lift in interest in this field, the field of medicine?
It is dramatic. It has been dramatic from the very beginning. When the labs were shut down at UT at the end of March, the first labs that were allowed to resume work were labs working on COVID-19 projects, and these range everywhere from air purifiers to the vaccine to everything in between. And they formed kind of a loose, informal group of people who were doing this. And in my core lab, we were working on 2 COVID projects. But one of the comments I really want to make, this has really amplified what people are doing. And what it also demonstrated almost immediately was the ability and the desire to be able to pivot whatever research you were doing towards this problem. And I was so heartened. And we had a couple of meetings of all of us who were involved in a variety of projects. Again, it might be from a public policy standpoint, down to, Jason McClellan, who's at the University of Texas, was the one who actually identified the spike protein and has been working with Moderna. And this has been his area of study for decades. But I think the public needs to understand the intensity with which people were willing to shift what they were working on to solve this problem has really, to me, it's really sent a message. When you're at a public university, there's just this plethora of research going on. No one really knows what it is. They're now finding out with this disease what has been going on. But I think it's really incumbent on our states to understand why it's so important, not to keep taking money away from public universities, but to give it to them, because the response has just been incredible all throughout the university. And again, it's not just the science piece of it. It was, Lauren Myers, with the predictive analytics, putting together the best way to communicate things to the public. It's really a wonderful thing. And as Tim is describing some of the ways people are going to move forward, I think that has been kind of the silver lining of this pandemic. And I'm always looking for the silver lining of anything. But I think people are now have a mission to do things differently and not to do it the same old way, to do things that make more sense, that give access to greater numbers of people.
Work together.
Yes, and to work together. The collaborations have just been incredible. There's a company that spun out of UT from the College of Pharmacy, Gerardo, that's making these thin layer films. They've been making them for years, that they can be reconstituted into vaccines so they can be shipped so easily without the requirement of the cold chain to all over the world. I mean, so people are looking at these global solutions.
And you said it earlier, single payer systems just seem to be more efficient right now because they've got data, they've got ways to administer, and they've got the infrastructure. I think one thing that we're discovering in the U.S., I know that the medical profession has been disjointed for a while, and people know there's issues there. But this spotlights to what extent there is so much disjointness in this industry, to the fact that people don't talk to each other, and it takes something like this for people to start working together and figuring out back channels of how do we build things together, how do we be more efficient. We've got the brain power. It's just communicating that.
Yeah. No, and when you point out there also is that, over recent years, hospitals were judged on their financials, not how great they were taking care of people. Right. And I think as a result, we're seeing that, especially in rural areas, but even in cities, they have limited capacity to do what they need to do for all the folks who are requiring hospitalization.
Speaking of working together, as you know, it was a Science in the Mall, y'all, that we're producing in conjunction with ACC Biosciences Incubator. How do you guys work together with them? How do you work with Nancy and the folks down there? How do you have that relationship?
So I'll jump into that. So I've been working with the Bioscience Incubator since it was an idea at ACC. We actually worked with the leadership there to help them sort of frame the idea. We provided some guidance on because we had built a GMP facility in Austin, in Cedar Park, actually. We had expertise in our team. And so we have been privileged really to be able to sort of watch this unfold over a number of years. And it has been a resounding success, I have to say. People, like Nancy, and some of the other folks who were part of the earlier evolution of it have done a phenomenal job in standing that up and having it serve as a really critical resource to the life science ecosystem in Central Texas.
Yeah. That's what I'm noticing as I'm talking to people that actually work with ACC Biosciences Incubator, the different companies that are coming out of there. It just blows my mind. And many of them say it wouldn't be possible without these facilities. I mean, there's just so much that goes into it. Yeah,
there's not a lot of facilities in the Austin area. I have some small amount of wet lab space that we share with innovators, and I've really enjoyed working with Nancy, her team at the Bioscience Incubator. We first really got involved together when they were kind of launching, before the lab was really even open. And over the past several years, Nancy and I have been part of a collective, we call it an affinity group, for folks in the Central Texas area who are doing some of the same things. And what's really great is that, Nancy has just an amazing, top shelf wonderful equipment and a setup that is accessible to so many people, where they don't have to bring in their own equipment unless they have specialized equipment. And that's something that innovators really need at this early stage. They don't have the money to buy these expensive pieces of equipment. And there are several of us who have space or access to space and programs, and we all do something a little bit differently. And what's wonderful about the ecosystem that's been created in Austin is that we collaborate. We are not competitive. We all have our own things that work well for some innovators and not for others. And so Nancy and I have really worked together so well, trying to help identify, sometimes one of her folks might want to come over to my space for a certain reason and vice versa. So they have really been able to, I think, attract a lot of folks into the Austin area based on the space that they have and the services that they provide, and continue to expand.
Yeah, I've been really impressed with the services, but also the people that are working there and the things that they're working on. And it's as I'm discussing with them, having discussions, I'm like, wow, that is such a new and more efficient way of doing things for sure. And we're all about, one of the things I love is efficiencies. One of the things that we were talking about earlier, Tim, was sometimes the inefficiencies of a system. We were talking about the purchasers of vaccines are usually governments on large scale, and a lot of times the people that are creating the vaccines are just going to follow the orders of what the government says, but the government's not pushing or leading innovation. So to move from an injectable vaccine to a nasal, sometimes it's got to be the new innovators that are coming up with these ideas, and then someone up in government that's been purchasing these for like 20, 30, 40, 50 years. It's done this way. No, there's a new way of doing it, but the infrastructure is already set up the old way. So that's what I gathered anyway. If I crossed your words at all there, Tim, that's what I thought I heard from it. Is that more or less the case?
Yeah, historically, it's been a kind of a closed loop, and that seems to be changing now. And certainly the whole issue of a pandemic event of this magnitude, it has to drive different thinking. And so we're beginning to see more funding that's being directed at alternative approaches to solving not just the development of the countermeasure, the vaccine itself, but also the downstream processes, the delivery systems, and ways to sort of reduce the impact on the healthcare infrastructure. So more of that has started unfolding in the past year, and hopefully we will see that really take root. I mean, I think we're on the cusp of a significant paradigm shift here of the old way. Paradigms are really challenging to change. I mean, there's really only two ways to do it. Either you have the power to basically wave your hand and say, we're going to do it a different way, or the system itself breaks or it explodes in some way and then reemerges and reorganizes itself in a different and hopefully, more effective manner.
Yeah,
and, the latter approach can be pretty chaotic, and I think that's where they're in the midst of. I also wanted to mention, just to sort of reinforce some of the comments that Janet was making about collaboration and people pivoting. A really good example of that is back in 2003, 2004, we had the first epidemic of a coronavirus, which was the original SARS epidemic, and it was principally concentrated in China. A lot of people maybe don't remember back that far, but it was quite concerning. It spread very rapidly, but it obviously didn't reach the magnitude. We were able to sort of stop it. But in the intervening years, it's been 16, 17 years since that happened. Nobody has developed a vaccine for it, right? Yeah. And it is a coronavirus, right? And fortunately, we as a civilization, we pivoted. People worked together, and we came up with a vaccine, and actually have got it out in less than a year. I mean, that's truly, the comparison of those two examples are truly amazing.
Well, when Janet says it normally takes 13, 14, 15 years to roll something out,
right.
We get it out in less than a year. That's really impressive. I think one of the biggest concerns now is variants, right? How concerned are you guys about variants as opposed to what we have out now and how effective it is? Has that shaken your confidence at all about summertime and some of the numbers that they're talking about in the summer?
Well, I think there's two aspects to that. Of course, the variants are very concerning because we were hoping that there wouldn't be any, which was somewhat not real logical. There's always variants. I mean, that's why there's a different flu vaccine every year. Mm-hmm. And so, but some of these tend to be, what's coming out tend to be a little more dramatic than what we've been seeing. So I'm very concerned about that. But I think to me, it boils down to educating people that we have to think that it's still really important to get the current vaccine. But yes, there's probably going to be somewhat of like an annual or some sort of regular inoculation to address, whatever variants come out. That's from the vaccine technical standpoint. From a personal standpoint, I've had many conversations with friends and colleagues about what is reentry going to look like and how comfortable are we going to be sitting in the same room as opposed to sitting on the same screen. Because
I watch movies these days and see how people are sharing food and all this. And I'm like, oh, I wouldn't do that. But just a year ago, we were
Yeah, the last thing I want to watch is something that addresses the coronavirus. Let me tell you, I want to see anything but that, because we're living it. But I think that we're going to be seeing masks for a long time. Mm-hmm. I think that we all have fatigue. But I think if we can hang in there until we start approaching herd immunity, that's when things are going to change. I'm not sure if we're ever going to really be back to what we did. I mean, I started doing elbow bumps, at the beginning of March last year. People kind of looked at me and I said, it's all about health. Yeah. I think handshakes might be gone for a while.
I agree. Tim, thoughts on variants?
I think so we're very concerned about genetic, evolution of this. And I think fundamentally what people need to understand is that you're dealing with a live thing here, that evolves, and its purpose in life is to survive and to continue to exist and to thrive and to spread, right? And so the fight for this, I think, is going to continue. In part, what I mentioned before about the development of a vaccine platform, right, that can rapidly be evolved in order to try and reduce the time it takes to respond to variants that may emerge in this is part of the solution for this. I think in a broader context, when I talked about paradigm shift in the vaccine space, that also applies to the broader context of living. I think we're entering, what we've been referring to as post-normal times, right? I think this event that we're living through in the midst of will have generational impacts over the next several generations, right? And it goes beyond just health and into economics and things of that nature. I mean, those are all higher order impacts that are flowing out of this type of a global health event. And so I think people need to be prepared to, deal with change. I mean, I don't think there is going to be a return to the way it was.
No silver bullet, but we're working towards improvement.
There's a new normal that we're going to have to embrace and figure out how to live and be happy in.
There's so much going on. I mean, with Tim, what you're doing and how that's evolving and how that can impact so many people. When I look at the researchers that I'm working with, it's for a while we were wondering if science was going to be cool, and it's cool again.
this mission of what we're doing with this podcast is really that, just let people know what other people are doing, because it's really cool stuff. Yeah. And the more people can hear that, and the more people can, that's why I was so into pointing what those problems are, because there's inefficiencies in the system. If we can just think bottom up and innovation first, we can just solve so many things much quicker. Yeah. But it takes a lot of people hearing that message to be able to ask the right questions.
Yeah, there's an approach to that we use, when we're developing technology, and it's out there and fairly prevalent. It's called first principles, right? Which is really defining. You have to define the root of the problem that you're trying to solve, and not a symptom of the problem. And then when you develop your solution, that's what you're focused on, and you sort of ignore all of the other ways of doing it and getting sidetracked in that, that sort of thing. And oftentimes when you take that approach, right, which is, you come up with very different types of strategies that don't fall into the sort of the typical way of doing things. And part of the challenge that we have found is trying to break the grip, if you will, of the existing paradigm on the way things are done, in order to sort of think creatively and strategically about how to solve these kind of problems in a different way.
Tim, that's really interesting, because when I came to UT in 2008, and I'd have graduate students come up to me saying, "Hey, what do you think of this idea?" Because they knew I'd been in pharma. Mm-hmm. And I'd say, "What problem does it solve?"
Yeah.
"Well, but this is unique and I can patent it." And I remember one time I said, "You see this chair next to me? I can patent that. But if it's not solving a problem that someone's having about their chair, they're not going to buy it." So that's when I taught. I'm not required to teach, but I designed a course around, how to put a market-focused component into your research plan. And now that's evolved into this, I'm teaching a whole cadre of courses now, but the one that I'm teaching in the spring, it's a practicum. And really walking from everything from a product description and early market research to really focusing on that value proposition. Because if you don't understand who your customers and stakeholders are, right, and just because you can do something novel doesn't mean it's solving a problem. And it can take so long and so many pivots. And I always tell my class two things when we begin the semester. I say, if you haven't pivoted in this course, it means you haven't done the work. And second of all, call your parents and let them know you're okay.
Good advice for sure.
And again, I'm going to go back to, I think we have to educate people, because, when you've been working on things for years and decades, it sounds really reasonable. But to make a big change and move to a totally different way to administer a product, we have to bring people along with us. And so whether that means educating them as we go, or kind of like, you can't expect for somebody to hear something on Monday and feel good about it on Wednesday, or even, 6 months down the road, unless it takes many times for people to really catch on and understand the benefits. And that's what you have to do. It's like doing a pitch.
As humans, we have naturally short attention spans. So if we have a problem, we're going to deal with it. But if that problem becomes less of a problem and I can put it down the pecking order, I will. And so it sounds like to me, what both Tim and Janet have said is that when SARS came out the first time, 2004, there was a problem. We addressed it. We threw firepower at it, and then it wasn't that big of a deal anymore. So we just moved along. Right. And it's not until now where it's like, oh, we really need to pay attention. Is that more or less what you guys?
The difference is that the economics of solving the original SARS coronavirus, didn't warrant the sort of focus and attention, that attracted, enough interest to solve that particular problem, like SARS-CoV-2. Mm-hmm. And that's a direct result of the virulence, right? And it's the virulence, and the morbidity and mortality rates that really drove that decision. And that's the that aspect of human nature sort of reflects itself a lot. Most people, it's called time span of discretion. It's how far out into the future, can you sort of think effectively, is relatively short. I mean, and it's that we set up in 2004 or 5, BARDA was formed, and Bush put $2 billion into HHS to form BARDA, and BARDA was essentially chartered to basically develop the health strategy to protect the civilian population in the United States against bioterror, naturally occurring and man-made bioterror threats. And by 2008 or 9, we had something called the Strategic National Stockpile setup, right? And they're in non-disclosed locations around the country, and they stockpiled, and they continued to develop countermeasures to put into those. And I think by the time we hit 2014 or 2015, most of that stuff was expired, dated, not refreshed.
Yeah.
Some of it had been used in the H1N1 and never put back in. That's where the ventilators came from.
I was curious when this first came up. I'm like, boy, I tell you what, much as we spent in our defenses for the U.S., we certainly have spotlighted a weak area when it comes to if this was developed. And we know I'm not going to get into that theory or anything like that, but if it was, how ill prepared we would have been. Well, today's been a wonderful discussion with you both. I'm so glad that you guys came on the show and shared insight with the audience. And really have enjoyed having this conversation.
Excellent.
Thanks so much.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you again, Janet and Timothy, for taking the time to talk and educate us. Our conversation has made understanding vaccines much more accessible. Keep up the great work, and I'm excited to see what you and your organizations do in the future. If you'd like to learn more about Janet and Timothy, please visit the link in our show notes. Science in the Mall, y'all, is created in partnership between Founding Media and the Austin Community College Bioscience Incubator. To learn more about the ACC Bioscience Incubator, please visit the link in our show notes. If you like what you hear on this show, be sure to subscribe and share it with a friend or family member.